The sound of laughter was the first thing that hit him. It was a cruel, sharp laugh that cut through the sunny air of the schoolyard. Then came the sound of fabric tearing. Not just any tear, but the specific, unmistakable sound of adhesive tape being ripped off with force. Standing in front of a semicircle of students was Matthias, a 9-year-old boy, frozen in place. His sports shorts were around his ankles, and his diaper, his greatest vulnerability, was exposed and then pulled down by a bigger boy. Laughter erupted, phones were raised. Matthias just stood there, his face blank, while his inner world imploded. At the edge of the playground near the fence, a man in a suit watched everything. He didn't shout. His face didn't contort with anger. He just watched, his eyes recording every detail with terrifying calm. The bullies didn't know it, but the silent father witnessing this humiliation was Rafael Vargas, a federal judge, and he was about to teach them a lesson about cause and effect. That wasn't in any school book. Which city are you from? We want to know. If you believe that the humiliation of a child is an offense that the universe will not leave unanswered, sign up. You'll want to know what happens when justice takes off its robe and puts on the skin of a father. Judge Rafael Vargas was a man trained to dissect chaos and find order. In his courtroom, he presided over cases of corruption, organized crime, disputes that could bring down governments. He was a master of cold logic, an architect of the law. But there, standing behind the school fence, he was not a judge. He was the father of a boy whose soul was being publicly torn apart, and all his power seemed like a joke. His first reaction was not a scream, but a procedural instinct. He studied the faces of the attackers, memorizing each one. He observed the spectators, those who laughed and those who turned away, accomplices in their silence. He noted the absence of any supervisor or teacher. Facts, evidence. That was how his mind worked, even as his heart shattered. He waited until the crowd dispersed and Matthias was left alone before slowly walking toward him, the sound of his shoes on the asphalt sounding like hammer blows. He knelt down, straightened his son's clothes, and without saying a word took him to the car. The trip home was filled with a thick, heavy silence. Matthias, who was selectively verbal, said nothing. He just stared out the window, his fingers tapping a complex, rapid rhythm on the glass, his only outlet. To Rafael, his son's silence was louder than any scream. At home, his wife, Helena, a gentle smiling architect, saw the two of them the moment they walked in and knew. Rafael's face was a mask of controlled fury that she knew well from his most difficult cases. Matthias's spirit seemed to have shrunk inside his body. When Rafael finally told her what had happened, his voice was low, almost a whisper, which made it even more terrifying. Rafael's outburst was not for the world to hear. It happened late at night in the silence of his office, a place that was normally his sanctuary of logic and order. He didn't punch the wall. He didn't scream. He sat in his leather chair and cried. A silent cry. The cry of a man who sent people to prison but couldn't protect his own son from a gang of teenagers. He cried for the diaper, a symbol of Matthias's slowest journey, a vulnerability they had always protected so carefully. He cried for the stolen innocence, for the broken trust. And in the midst of that pain, something else emerged. A clarity as cold and sharp as steel. The anger solidified into purpose. Those boys weren't the real problem. They were the symptom of a larger disease. The indifference of the institution, the arrogance of his parents, the culture that allowed the strong to devour the weak. He, Rafael Vargas, knew the system like the back of his hand. He knew how to dismantle it. The outburst gave way to an oath. They humiliated his son. He, in turn, would not humiliate them. He would make them irrelevant. He would use the law not as a sword of vengeance but as a scalpel to cut the cancer at its root. The Vanguardia Institute was not just a school. It was a promise. When Rafael and Helena decided to enroll Matthias, they were seduced by a vision of modernity and inclusion. The school, with its bold architecture and sophisticated marketing, sold itself as an oasis of progressive education. The principal, Ms. Beatriz Lacerda, a soft-spoken woman in impeccable suits, had been especially convincing. "We don't believe in a one-size-fits-all model," she said in the initial interview, her eyes conveying a rehearsed sincerity. "Here at Vanguardia, we celebrate neurodiversity. We see each child as a unique ecosystem that needs personalized care to flourish." She showed them the sensory room, a small space with fiber optic lights and varied textures, which they would later discover was used mainly as a storage room. Hope was a balm for their anxious hearts. They had taken Matthias out of a previous school where he was simply ignored. Vanguardia, with its exorbitant tuition fees and waiting list, seemed like the safest investment in their son's future and happiness. They believed in the website, the brochures, the promise of a safe environment where Matthias's vulnerability would be protected and his unique intelligence nurtured. The first few months were deceptively calm. Matthias seemed stable. He liked the library and the science lab. The problems, however, were bubbling beneath the surface. The school culture was fiercely competitive, not only among the students, but among the parents. Wealth and status were openly flaunted, and a small group of boys, led by a boy named Ricardo, the son of an influential businessman, acted as if the school was their private fiefdom. The warning signs were there, but they were dismissed as isolated incidents. Once Matthias's snack disappeared. Another time he came home with a scratch on his arm that he couldn't explain. Helena called the school, and Mrs. Beatrice's response was always the same. Let's keep an eye on it. Kids are like that. They're learning to navigate their social dynamics. The phrase social dynamics was a euphemism for the law of the jungle that operated in the hallways. The false hope was the belief that the school was, in fact, watching. It was the belief that the principal, with her talk of inclusion, was actively working to create a safe environment. The truth is that the school was more concerned with not upsetting the powerful parents of the problem students than with protecting the vulnerable ones. The sensory room was a marketing ploy. The neurodiversity talk was a script. The culmination of this illusion was the playground incident. It happened during the annual Gymkhana, an event that was supposed to promote team spirit. The school failed to supervise properly, failed to intervene, failed to protect. The promise of a safe haven turned out to be a facade. They had paid for a fortified castle and in the end discovered that the gates were open and the guards were asleep. The hope they bought was not only false, it was a fraud. And the pain of that betrayal was almost as acute as the humiliation of their child. The cruelty displayed in the schoolyard was not born in a vacuum. It was cultivated in an ecosystem of arrogance, neglect, and fear, where none of the actors saw themselves as the villain of the story. Ricardo Valente, the leader of the Bullies, did not consider himself evil. He was the product of his father, a construction magnate named Ottavio Valente. Ottavio was a man who saw the world as a competition. He taught his son that there are two types of people, predators and prey. In his twisted philosophy, leadership was demonstrated through domination. Ricardo saw Matthias not as a boy, but as the other, an easy target who, because he was different, somehow deserved what he got. The humiliation in the schoolyard in his teenage mind was not an act of malice but an affirmation of his own status, a spectacle for his audience. He was just following the script his father gave him to be a winner. Ottavio Valente, for his part, was a man who confused power with virtue. When the school contacted him about Ricardo's behavior, his reaction was always aggressive. "My son has a strong personality. He's a born leader," he would say. "Maybe the other boy is too sensitive. The world isn't going to adapt to him." He donated generous sums to the school, not out of philanthropy, but as a transaction. He was buying leniency, ensuring that his son could operate above the rules. For him, the incident was just kids being kids, and the victim was an obstacle his son had overcome. His conflict was not with morality, but with anyone who dared to suggest that his son, and by extension himself, was not perfect. The principal, Ms. Beatriz Lacerda, lived in a state of perpetual conflict. She was not a cruel person. She probably started her career with noble ideals about education, but years of managing the Vanguardia Institute, with its wealthy and demanding clientele, had worn her down. She had become an administrator of fear. Her main goal was no longer to educate, but to appease. She feared Ottavio Valente and his influence on the board. She feared negative publicity. She feared losing enrollment. When confronted with Ricardo's behavior, she chose the path of least resistance. A superficial conversation, an empty warning, a hope that the problem would go away on its own. She saw Matthias and his vulnerability not as a child to be protected, but as a complex problem, that threatened the precarious balance she struggled to maintain. Her inaction was not malice, but cowardice. She was caught between what was right and what was easy, and she chose the easy way every time. Human conflict was this complex web. A boy taught to be a predator, a father who believed that power buys impunity, and a principal who sacrificed her principles on the altar of image and convenience. None of them woke up in the morning planning to ruin a child's life, but their combined choices, their arrogance, their greed, and their cowardice created the perfect conditions for cruelty to flourish in broad daylight. And they were about to discover that sometimes the other they chose as their target has a father whose job is to dismantle exactly this kind of rotten system. Raphael's transformation of pain into action was not an explosion. It was a tectonic shift, silent and profound. The image of his son, humiliated in the courtyard, became the canvas on which he would project his most meticulous strategies. The turning point did not happen in a courtroom, but at the dinner table in his home, in a conversation with Helena. Raphael, with his judge's mind, was already charting a course of litigation, lawsuits, and financial ruin. But Helena, with her emotional wisdom, touched on a different point. Raphael's suing will take years. It will be public. It will force Matthias to relive all of this in court. That won't heal the wound. Justice for our son isn't about money or revenge. It's about making sure that playground is safe for the next child like him. Helena's words were key. She shifted the goal from punishment to prevention, from revenge to reform. The silent turning point was Raphael's decision not to use his power as a hammer, but as a flashlight to expose all the rot hidden in the dark corners of the Vanguardia Institute. His first step was an act of strategic patience. Instead of calling the principal and making threats, he sent a formal, restrained email requesting a meeting to discuss a campus safety incident involving his son. He also requested in the same email a complete copy of the school's safety and anti-bullying policy mentioned in the student handbook. He knew that bureaucracy was the first battleground. While waiting for a response, he began his own investigation. He didn't use court resources, he used Google. He searched the school's name along with words like complaint, bullying, and negligence. He found old forums, forgotten blog posts, and he found a pattern. Stories from other parents, less influential, whose concerns had been swept under the rug by Ms. Beatrice. The school's response arrived 2 days later. It was a vague email from the principal, regretting any misunderstanding and inviting them for a chat. Attached was a 15-page PDF document entitled Zero Tolerance Policy on Bullying. It looked professional, complete with graphics and quotes. Here, the turnaround gained new momentum. Raphael, the judge, gave way to Raphael, the investigator. He spent the night reading the document but also analyzing its properties. And he found something. In the file's metadata, there was an author and a creation date. The file had been created the previous afternoon, and the author's name was not anyone from the school, but from a consulting firm called Ready-Made Educational Solutions. With a quick search, he discovered that it was an online company that sold generic school policies for $300. The school did not have a policy. They bought one in a hurry after he asked for it. Zero tolerance was a fraud. This discovery was the turning point. It was no longer his word against a bunch of kids. He now had irrefutable documentary evidence of institutional negligence and fraud. He had the beginnings of a case that could not be ignored or minimized. The silent turnaround was complete. He no longer needed to raise his voice. The facts would speak for him. With the discovery of the fraudulent policy, the chessboard changed. Raphael and Helena went from defensive to offensive, and every move was calculated. The following weeks were marked by a series of small but crucial victories that, together, built a compelling case. The first victory was finding the other. Guided by clues from online forums, Raphael contacted a couple, the parents of a boy named Lucas, who had left Vanguardia the previous year. The meeting was tense at first. The couple was bitter and reluctant to relive the trauma. Lucas had been relentlessly bullied by the same group as Ricardo Valente for wearing thick glasses. They had complained dozens of times to Ms. Beatrice. The response was always the same. We are aware and taking appropriate action. They finally took their son out when he started having panic attacks. Victory came when Raphael showed them the PDF of the anti-bullying policy. Lucas's father, a software engineer, laughed bitterly. They told us last year that the policy was under final review. Apparently, the review took until a judge's son was attacked. They agreed to write a sworn statement detailing their experience and the school's inaction. The first crack in the dam had appeared. The second victory was an anonymous gift. A week after the discovery of the fake policy, a brown envelope with no return address arrived at the law office of a friend of Raphael's. Inside was a flash drive. The flash drive contained internal email records from the school's system. There were dozens of email exchanges between Ms. Beatriz and Ottavio Valente. In one, the principal warned about Ricardo's increasingly aggressive behavior. Valente's response was cold. "Beatriz, focus on my son's education, and I'll focus on making sure your new science lab gets funded. Don't bother me with trivialities." It was proof of collusion, of implicit bribery, of rot at the heart of the administration. Raphael suspected that an IT employee or a teacher with a guilty conscience had leaked it. It was a huge risk for whoever did it, and a turning point for them. The third victory was with Matthias himself. Helena, with her infinite patience, worked to rebuild her son's security. She took him out of school immediately, citing health reasons. They spent days in museums, parks, places where Matthias's curiosity could flourish. One afternoon, while assembling a complex puzzle of the solar system, Matthias said out of the blue, "The angry boy. His father is angry too." Helena asked how he knew. "The smell," said Matthias. "The smell of metal rain." It was Matthias's synesthetic way of describing the anger and arrogance he felt emanating from Ricardo and his father on the day they visited the school. Matthias was no stranger to this. He perceived the world on a level that others could not. The victory was not just the fact that he was speaking, but the validation that his perception was real and profound. Each of these victories, the witness, the digital evidence, Matthias's resilience, was a nail in the coffin of the Vanguardia Institute's impunity and the Valente family. Revenge was becoming sweeter and more complete than Raphael had ever imagined, because it wasn't about destroying a boy, but about exposing the truth of an entire corrupt system. On the eve of the meeting that would seal the fate of the Vanguardia Institute, Raphael was not reviewing documents. He was sitting on the floor of Matthias's room, watching his son build an entire city out of wooden blocks. It was not a chaotic city. There was a logic to it, with paths, parks, and quiet areas. Matthias was creating an orderly world, a safe world, and at that moment Raphael's journey crystallized into a profound reflection. He thought about his power. As a federal judge, he had the power to interpret the law, to change lives with the stroke of a pen, to impose the order of the state. However, in the face of his son's humiliation, that power proved abstract, distant. A father's pain could not be appeased by a court order. The real turning point, he realized, did not come when he decided to use his knowledge of the law, but when he and Helena decided to fight not as a judge and his wife, but as parents. His initial motivation, he admitted to himself, was revenge. He wanted to see the panic in Ottavio Valente's eyes. He wanted to see Ricardo's arrogance turn to fear. He wanted to see Mrs. Beatriz's facade crumble. But as the fight progressed, something changed. Getting to know Lucas's parents, receiving anonymous help from the school employee, witnessing Matthias's resilience, all of this transformed his anger into a cause. He was no longer fighting just for his son. He was fighting for Lucas, for the anonymous child who would come next, for the integrity of the very notion of education. He looked at Matthias's city of blocks and saw a metaphor. Society like that city needed rules, structures, but it also needed safe spaces, areas of silence, respect for different ways of existing. The law, without compassion, was just a set of cold blocks. Justice, he understood on a deeper level, was not about punishing offenders. It was about protecting and repairing the structure so that everyone could build their own cities in peace. His final reflection was on Matthias himself. The world saw his son through a lens of deficits, his speech delay, his need for diapers, his social difficulties. But Raphael now saw his superpowers, Matthias's synesthetic perception, his ability to see the metal rain of anger, his need for order and logic. These were gifts. The mistake of nature, as the principal of another school had once called a child, was actually a way of being that had its own beauty and wisdom. The struggle was not to make the world tolerant of Matthias's weakness, but to make the world worthy of his strength. That night, Judge Rafael Vargas reconciled with his father, Rafael Vargas. He understood that his greatest power did not lie in the gavel of the court, but in the example he would set. The next day's meeting would not be an act of revenge. It would be an act of construction. He was about to demolish a rotten structure not out of hatred, but to clear the ground and help build something better in its place. His son's block city had taught him the most important lesson of his career. The meeting was not held in the school auditorium, but in a neutral conference room as requested by Rafael. On one side of the long mahogany table sat Rafael and Helena, along with Lucas's parents. On the other side sat a visibly shaken Mrs. Beatriz, Otavio Valente with an expression of bored disdain, and the school's lawyer. There were no shouting matches. Rafael conducted the meeting with the precision of a surgeon. He made no accusations. He presented facts. He began by projecting the anti-bullying policy. Ms. Lacerda, this is the policy that the school sent us. Can you confirm that this is the official policy in effect? She nodded hesitantly. Then he projected the screenshot from the online company that sold the document for $300,000, with the date of purchase highlighted. Can you explain then why your current policy was purchased the day after we formally requested it? The principal's face fell. Otavio Valente tried to intervene with his usual arrogance. What's the point of all this? Kids fight. Yours is weak. Mine is strong. End of story. Rafael turned to him, his eyes cold. Mr. Valente, we are not here to discuss the nature of our children. We are here to discuss the legal responsibility of the institution, and potentially yours. He then projected the emails between Valente and the principal, where funding for the lab was contingent on her silence about Ricardo's behavior. The school's lawyer paled. This went beyond negligence. It bordered on extortion. The presentation continued. The sworn statement from Lucas's parents. The analysis of the pattern of incidents. In the end, Rafael presented the options, not as a threat, but as an inevitability. Option A public lawsuit against the school for gross negligence and fraud, and against Mr. Valente for interference. The documents will be sent to the press and the Ministry of Education. Option B, we reach an agreement, here and now. The agreement he proposed was not monetary, it was transformative. The immediate expulsion of Ricardo and the other aggressors, the resignation of Mrs. Beatriz, the creation of a fund financed by a substantial and irrevocable donation from Otavio Valente to implement a state-of-the-art inclusion and neurodiversity program, audited by an external company chosen by the parents, a formal written apology to all affected families. Valente, cornered and advised by his terrified lawyer, gave in. The victory was total, silent, and devastating for them. The real hope, however, is seen 6 months later. Matthias is in a new school, smaller and truly inclusive. He no longer needs diapers. The stress that was holding him back is gone. At the end-of-year party, he stands in the corner, excitedly explaining the rules of a complex board game he invented to another child, who listens with genuine interest. Helena and Rafael watch from afar. The pain of that day in the playground will never completely disappear, but it has become the fuel for real change. They didn't just protect their son. They honored his uniqueness, forcing a small corner of the world to become a safer and fairer place, not just for him, but for all who would come after him. And that, they knew, was the truest form of justice. A child's vulnerability is never a weakness. It is an invitation for the strength of the community to reveal itself in the form of protection and justice. If this story touched your heart and strengthened your belief in justice, please like it, comment with a message of support, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and courage. Share this video. Somewhere, a father or mother may be feeling powerless and needs to be reminded of the power that lies in truth and collective action.